First, thanks everybody for joining. And I just want to thank Ivy for hosting this fun little webinar. I'm hoping that you guys find the information useful. I don't know who's on here, but if you guys don't know about Ivy, they are an amazing team. They have a community specifically for interior designers, and they also help with business management tools. So if you don't know about them, definitely go check them out. So a little bit about me. I've been an interiors photographer now for about 6 years. And I originally got started with it as part of my master's degree in photography. So I kind of just started working on something else related to interiors and then started shooting interiors more. So that's kind of how I got to, that's kind of how I got to be where I am. So today we're gonna talk, I have a couple of topics for you guys. We're gonna talk about finding your photographer to work with, and then what you should be expecting from your photo shoot. And then we'll talk a little bit about the importance of storytelling and lighting. And then we'll go over some tips and tricks for you guys to, when you're taking pictures with your phone or for Instagram, just to add a little extra polish to it or something. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So let's get started with probably the hardest part is finding the right photographer for you, for your designs. So ideally you want to find a photographer that shoots interiors in particular. The reason being that in shooting interiors and architectures comes with its own set of like challenges, including lighting and composition and just little trips, little tweaks and stuff that you need to sort of be aware of in order to make sure everything has a nice little polish to it, kind of like how you would see it in a magazine. So you also want to find a photographer that has a consistent shooting style, and then especially one that meshes with your particular designs. For example, if you are a designer that has a very bright and airy look to your designs, you want to find probably a photographer that works mostly with natural light or that lights in a way that mimics natural light. Some photographers that are interior photographers or architectural photographers use sort of different techniques. Some might use something called HDR. And what HDR is, if you're not familiar with it, is basically a photographer takes a bunch of different shots and then combines them to form one shot. And you can, and depending on the photographer, that look can start to look a little bit surreal or overworked. And so if that's not if that aesthetic doesn't not blend with your design aesthetic, then you probably want to find someone else. Additionally, when you do find a photographer, I would recommend you find one that you love. And the reason being that working with a photographer consistently gets you two things. It means your imagery for your marketing and your website will have a consistent look, much like your designs will. And also it helps working with the same photographer to help you, it helps that photographer come to understand your needs and your design approach, which is super important. An example would be like, not every photographer frames everything the same way, or not every photographer has the same approach, for example, to whether they do overall shots versus lots of vignette shots. So when you are presenting your portfolio, you want to make sure you have a consistent voice across all your images. Let's see here. My mouse is stuck. Okay, here we go. The other thing, when you do find a photographer, there's some things that you definitely want to talk to them about. You want to talk to them about their rates. So what do the rates include? Do they include supplemental lighting? As we know, not all interiors have amazing natural light. Do they include an assistant fee? Do they include post-processing? Which post-processing would be anything involving photoshopping, like correcting balance, color correcting an image, removing chords, anything like that. If you anticipate that you will need extensive photoshopping, for example, something like there's a piece of furniture that you ordered 2 of, but you've only gotten 1 of, and so you might need to combine 2 images. That's definitely possible, but make sure you discuss that with the photographer ahead of time. And then the last thing that is probably super important is you want to talk about the contract, whether they use one, and if there's going to be usage rights for the images. Usage rights basically means that you want to ask the photographer, how long are you allowed to use the images before they'll charge you again? And that can vary from photographer to photographer, but you definitely want to be clear ahead of time with what your needs are. For example, if you plan on just using the images for your portfolio and you would like to have the image usage forever or in perpetuity, then you want to be sure that that's included in the fee that you're paying the photographer. Additionally, if you think you might use the images in a commercial way, for example, for actual commercial advertising like billboards or anything like that, you should also check with the photographer that your contract covers those usage fees. Yeah, and so let me think. I think that's about all I have for you in terms of finding the right photographer. We'll get into a little bit more about like actually working with your photographer in the next section, which is what you're going to expect from a professional photo shoot. Okay, so you found your amazing photographer and now you're you're super excited to get this photo shoot done, which is the best part of the whole experience. So now what we're going to talk about is like, how can you make sure that you get the most out of your time with your photographer in your photo shoot? So some things right from the get-go. That when you're in a photo shoot, there's just never enough time. So make sure that you prioritize the shots that you're interested in getting. Styling always takes longer during a photo shoot than in real life. And then there's always going to be, for the photographer, there's always going to be lighting challenges, or what I like to call opportunities. And the reason I call them opportunities is because sometimes when there's a lighting challenge, it's really the time that you can make magic with an image, because you really get to use your imagination. And then the last thing I would say is like, photo shoots are fun. They're super stressful, but they're lots of fun. It's a great time to get collaborative and share like what you want from an image. So definitely you should be having fun during this experience. So, okay, so let's talk about how to make sure that you get the most out of your photo shoot. So something you want to ask your photographer when you're first sort of having the conversation is if they include a consultation visit, or what I call a walkthrough. And the reason for this is because during a walkthrough, this is your chance for the photographer to see the property and for you guys to discuss a shot list. So you want to focus in on the areas that you want to photograph. And so you come up with your shot list, and it's also a great time for the photographer to check out the lighting and see where there might be places where we need to add some additional lighting, or where they might tell you like, oh, I think this would look amazing, where it was something that you were like, I'm not so excited about that. And that's the wonderful thing about working with a professional photographer. Much like a designer, when a designer walks into somebody's home, you guys can see magic, where the person that might live there is like, it's okay. It's the same thing when you hire a photographer. Like, you might not be super excited about something, but we might see something and be like, oh my God, that's going to photograph awesome. So that's one of the advantages. So come up with your shot list beforehand, and then discuss any concerns that you might have about lighting, about an area that you feel isn't super great, but you'd like to get it in there. And, you know, a lot of times I usually, with my clients, I usually always try and I want them to tell me what they want, and I want to make it happen for them. So, you know, just tell the photographer what you want. And worst case scenario, they're like, that's not going to work. But more often than not, we can make anything work. Okay, let's talk about styling real quick. Styling is what takes the longest in any photo shoot. And the reason is this, is that essentially as a photographer, we're trying to take 3D space and turn it into flat space. And so the reason that it takes so long is because lines start to converge when everything's flattened. So we really have to be conscious of that. So we have to be conscious of objects touching each other, or how the furniture in the image is interacting in terms of like, does it look like it's too crowded? Does it look like it has too much space? So all those little tweaks and everything take a lot of time. And then the other reason is that in real life, you know, objects exist in a certain space in real life and they look okay in 3D space. But when you start to put a camera in between, you know, the view of the room and your eye, the lens on the camera sort of flattens everything and makes everything look small. So for those of you who've done a professional photo shoot, or you've actually probably done it yourself when you shot a room with your phone or something, you'll notice that everything looks super tiny. And the reason for that is just the way cameras compress space. So in that scenario, you sort of have to tweak things, and sometimes moving them forward, like away from the wall and stuff like that is really, that's that magic that gives an image that nice little polish. So you're like, oh, how did they do that? So be prepared to spend a lot of time on styling and doing little tweaks here and there that seem like crazy town, but it's really what makes an image come together and feel really nice and clean. In terms of styling, the other thing I would suggest is when you're bringing accessories to style, you definitely want to bring, better is more. Like you probably won't use them all, but bring lots to have options. And then if you have, for example, say you have specific shapes that you're working with, like you're working with an orb shape. If you have an orb shape that you want to use in your styling, please make sure that you bring multiple sizes of that orb, just so you can kind of play with the sizing and everything once you start to see what it looks like in camera. Just to backtrack here for a second, coming back to working with your photographer, the other thing I would recommend is to find out what the photographer's process is when they shoot. For example, I can only speak about my process. Like I shoot to my computer, directly to my computer, so the client gets to see the image as soon as it's made. And so as we're taking these shots, we're making little changes here and there because we already know what it looks like in camera, so we can tweak on the spot. So definitely that's a super easy way to see how things will look once you get your final image. Okay, I think that's all I've got for you in terms of the styling part. Let's see here. So the next topic we're going to talk about is storytelling. And storytelling is sort of related to, it's kind of related to two different topics. It's related to what we were just talking about in terms of styling, but it's also related to lighting. So we'll talk a little bit first about storytelling, and then we'll go into some lighting examples. So for the storytelling part, I will show you a couple of sets of images to sort of illustrate what cohesive storytelling might look like. So here we go. So storytelling is pretty self-explanatory. You're telling a story about a space. And photography, much like design, is about capturing a relationship between objects. So here we have 3 different images, and they're all from the same shoot. Whoops. So for this particular shoot, the style sort of, so let's backtrack a little bit. So when you're talking to your designer about, or your photographer, about what it is that you need in terms of your photographs, one thing you want to distinguish is the following. What are the photographs going to be used for? Are you going to only be using them for your website or your portfolio? Secondly, are you planning on pitching them to photo editors or magazines or anything like that? And the reason is this. Shooting for someone's portfolio or their website can be distinctly different than shooting for a magazine or a publication. And the reason being that photo editors or editors sort of look for slightly different things than you might include in your portfolio. So definitely let them know that up front. It can possibly affect the number of images that the photographer ends up taking. For example, you might only take, if it's only for a portfolio, you might take less images because you want it to be nice and simple and well put together and a cohesive set of images. If you're doing it for a publication, you might end up with a lot more images because publications like options. For example, you might shoot the hero shot from a couple of different angles in a room. You might shoot more vignettes from a couple of different angles. So make sure that you tell the photographer what it is that the final use could probably be. Okay, so just real quick here. So this particular project, this room that we shot is actually pretty small. It's just a living room area, and opposite from the couch where I'm standing in the first image is actually a TV. And then the rest of the room, I literally am super close to the couch. So in this for this particular project, the room feels cozy, and the designer made choices that sort of bring that out in the room. And so I wanted to make sure that I captured that coziness in the photographs. And so that's why everything is sort of like shot in a vignette style, and there aren't really any super pulled back shots because I wanted to sort of accentuate that. And so you can see that in each photograph, I try and bring in like some consistent element across all 3. In this particular case, it's the couch. It's the blue from the couch. We see it in the first shot with the vignette. It's the focus. And then we see it in the top, on the right-hand side on the top, you can see a little peek of the couch and the blue cushions. And then on the bottom image of the close-up vignette. So when you're thinking about how you want your images to come together, you sort of want to envision like what this little layout might look like for you. And like I said, as your photographer is doing the photos, you can definitely ask to take a peek. They should be showing them to you so you can make any sort of adjustments right then and there. So then let's see, we'll go on to the next one that's a little bit different. So this guy, oh, disappeared. There we go. So this particular project was very different than the one I just showed you previously. So this house has a super strong architectural influence to it, and it's a very big part of the design that went into it as well. So when you're doing something like when you're photographing a space like this, you want to make sure that you get sort of a more expansive feel and a bit more, I guess the word would be formal image. Like the structure of each image is very, very focused on lines and making sure everything's like that's vertical is supposed to be vertical and everything that's horizontal is supposed to be horizontal. And so when you have architecture interacting with design, that's a really important part. Like you want to make sure that your photographer is capturing that interaction, because as a designer, you made choices to incorporate that architecture into the design. And then the other thing I would say is that when it comes to storytelling, there's lots of little things that you can sort of capture or ask your photographer to capture that add that extra little, like, you know, that extra little quality to an image that makes it feel more dynamic. And one of those things comes through, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in the next section, it comes through lighting. If you look at the bottom image on the right-hand side, you'll see that the door is slightly open. I'm a big fan personally of leaving doors slightly open. And the reason is because to me, images feel lived in that way. They feel like, hey, there was someone just in the room and we're just sort of taking a peek at what it is to live in this space. And so you want to sort of keep an eye out for those opportunities of like, oh, someone was just in here and they just walked out. Like the opportunity to capture just like a little moment, if you will. And that's sort of the whole, the way I approach interiors is that when I walk into a space, I really try and think about how the space is going to be used and how the person that lives there is going to experience it and the things that are going to make them fall in love with the design. And for that, you know, you sort of focus on textures, you focus on the lighting choices that the designer made, and you focus on how like light interacts with their design choices and things like that. So that's actually a perfect lead in to the next part where we'll talk about lighting. So lighting, this amazing little shot has incredible lighting. I love everything about it. I love the streaming light coming from the right-hand side. I feel like it really makes a room come to life when we have amazing natural light like that. But lighting is one of the more challenging aspects of interior photography because, let's face it, a lot of it happens indoors. And so we don't always get these light-filled rooms. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, if you have a space that you're photographing and you think that the lighting is challenging in there, make sure that you have found a photographer that can handle a situation where it's very dim, or that they know how to light appropriately to to rectify the problem. Now, having said that, I also say that more light isn't always better. It just depends on the situation and sort of what the look it is that you're trying to achieve. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in one of the next slides. So let's see here. So this next slide, like I said, is what we just talked about, that sometimes more light isn't always the best option. So if you look on the left-hand side image, you'll see that's actually how dark it is in the space. So you can see it's really, really dark. So the inclination in that for a lot of people would be to go and open those shades. But in this particular case, we want to leave the shades closed because we want to make sure that the light in between the rooms is similar, so we can get what we have in the next on the left side is a nice clean image where we can see both rooms in the same sort of light. And this shot is definitely something that is a good example of how you can resolve lighting problems in a really simple way. if you just kind of know how to manipulate light. So like I said earlier, that's why it's important to find someone who really knows interiors and really knows how to work the light in an interior space. So in this particular case, we turned down the light to get the look that we wanted. And the next example I'll show you is we added light to a dark space. So here's my test shot from this awesome bedroom. It's super cozy and very luxurious. And so, but unfortunately, at that particular time of day, it was kind of on the dim side. So I thought to myself, and here's where the storytelling comes in my particular approach. I'm like, ooh, this bedroom looks like somewhere I want to wake up and like a nice sunny morning and read a book or have a cup of coffee, you know, just something cozy. And so I thought, okay, how do I do that? So on the right-hand side of the image, there's actually a window over there, but it's on a lower level of a house. And so there's not a lot of natural light that comes in. So what I did was I created light from outside the window to mimic the sun rising. So here we see the new image, and it looks so much better. It looks so much sunnier. It looks like a moment is happening where you're just either walking into the room after a long day and you're like, oh man, I can't wait to lay down in that bed and have some ice cream and watch Netflix. So this is, you know, these sorts of decisions are and choices and are things that you want to sort of be asking your photographer about. Oh, like this room is kind of dim. I'm hoping that we can maybe make some magic happen. Can you light it in a way that will kind of make it more dynamic? The other thing I want to mention briefly about lighting, and this comes up a bit when it comes to pitching photos to a publication. Make a decision about whether lights are on or off in an image. If you want to do both, that's totally fine, but make sure you have a set of images that has one or the other. For example, if you're shooting 5 images and you think you might want to have the lights on, make sure the lights are on in all 5 images. Same thing, if you just want to go with natural light, make sure it's natural light in all the images. So that way you can sort of like, if you're going to pitch the idea, you can pitch it with either way, because some magazines prefer lights off. I believe that's kind of the general aesthetic nowadays is lights off. So, but obviously if you have super cool lighting, you want to show off, you know, the cool lighting. If you, in the image before, that was just a test image, we had the pendant light on and you can see it cast a really cool shadow on the ceiling. So if, you know, I think we ended up going with the one that casts the shadow, but I can't totally remember. So, but it's good to have options, and it's easier to get it, like to ask for options while you're there than to go back and be like, oh man, we missed that shot. So you kind of, you know, you can always ask for variations of a shot too. Okay, so then the next one will be, we'll look at how lighting can help when you have really uneven lighting conditions. So here we have a backyard, and it's a gorgeous day outside, but unfortunately the table is in shadow now because the sun has moved to a different part of the yard. So, but we want it to be sunny, right? We want it to feel like we're going outside, we're gonna have a nice little brunch in the morning, and you know, we want to give it a little pizzazz. So, and this is a good example of when adding lighting is essential. So here's the final image. So you see we added some lighting to hit the table to really bring it to life, make it pop, like it shows off the accessories and the styling really well. You also see we got rid of some of the leaves that were on the ground, a little Photoshop action there. So you can see lighting for interiors is just, in terms of photography, is just as important as the lighting that you choose for your designs. So make sure that when you find the photographer, that they have a grasp on how to manipulate lighting, whether it be artificial lighting or natural lighting, to make sure that your designs are represented in the best way possible. Okay, I think that pretty much covers it. The next thing we'll talk about is just some tips and tricks for you guys when you're making your own pictures, whether it be for Instagram or your website or anything like that. Okay, the first thing we sort of talked about a little bit, but we'll talk about it a little bit more. One of the questions I get the most often is, why don't the photos on my camera look like the ones, like on my iPhone camera, look like the ones from a regular camera? The reason for that is that the camera on your phone is super wide angle. And so the way it treats space or compresses space is very different than a camera, like a regular SLR camera, or, you know, what we in our head call a regular camera. So that's one of the biggest issues about sort of how to, little tips and tricks to make your, if you're shooting for Instagram or something, I would recommend, if you have like another little, you know, even if it's a little point and shoot, to have that with you, and potentially use that instead of your camera or your iPhone or your cell phone. But if all you have is your cell phone, the one thing I would recommend is get closer. I used to teach photography websites to people, and that was the #1 thing I would say all the time. Get closer to whatever it is that you're shooting, and that will immediately make your image better. The other thing in terms of styling is that when you're shooting something that has a lot of accessories, when you're making a photograph of it, less is more. You want to avoid having lots and lots of stuff in your frame. And when you do have things in your frame, you want to sort of make sure that they're not all jammed together and that they're not all touching, and give every object a little bit of space to breathe. And then the next thing I would say is, and this is a big one, this is probably the most important thing, is that when you're shooting a space, the inclination when we shoot with our phones is to shoot at head level, like at eye level. But what happens with that is that what you often end up getting is that your walls are crooked. If you sort of look at some pictures, you'll see the walls are like leaning in or leaning out. So what you want to do is you want to keep your phone flat to the wall and make sure that your walls are straight up and down, and that any horizontals are level as well. And that, like I said, is a little easier to do with interior photographers and architectural photographers. We have these like special lenses that help us, like there's like a little button on them that makes like the lens go up and down without having to move the camera. So that helps us get those straight walls. But if you want to do it with your phone, you sort of want to like frame up the shot and then kind of move your phone around until you see the walls get straight, and then you know, move your phone up and down to see like, oh, hey, this height looks interesting. So try and vary your height, and unless you're shooting something like a close-up, try and avoid pointing your camera down. And then the other thing is about lighting. Like we just talked a bunch about lighting. So the best time to shoot a room, if you're doing it yourself, is when the light is the most even. And that means it could be dark in there. So try and shoot a room when the light is the most even, and that's usually early in the morning before any streaming light has started to come in, or midday when the sun's sort of right above and not hitting the window, coming in through the windows directly, or in the evening. I feel like cell phones nowadays do a pretty good job in low light situations. So just make sure that if you're shooting somewhere that's dim, you want to make sure that you're steadying yourself and holding your phone as steady as possible. I've actually used a cup to hold my phone steady in that situation, and like just put the timer on and let it take it that way. So I'm not like shaking the phone around. The other thing I would suggest is if you find yourself taking a lot of pictures with your phone, there are apps that can help you sort of, I don't want to say even out the lighting, but get the exposure a little closer to something that's normal if you have a lot of harsh lighting in the room. So I would, if you're interested in finding out what apps I use for that scenario, then definitely feel free to send me an email or something and I can talk to you more about that. I think that's pretty much it. So we'll take some questions now, and yeah, so let's see, let me try and get back here. Okay, so let's see. It looks like the first question is about photographing one room. The question is, what's the average rate for photographing one room? How much should be budgeted for professional photography in our marketing or dollars project? Well, let's see. It's sort of, that's a hard question to answer because a lot of it depends where you live and your market. So I'm a little bit skeptical about answering that for sure. But what I will tell you is that a lot of photographers don't necessarily work. A lot of us photographers can work on a day rate or a half day rate. So if you are only wanting to photograph one room, my suggestion would be to possibly try and get a couple more rooms that are ready to be done to maximize your dollar, if that makes sense. And in terms of how much should you budget for your photography, I mean, I usually try and tell clients to kind of, if you feel like a project is going to be amazing, then I would sort of work that into the budget of your whole project, so you kind of have it in your back pocket at the end. If you even if the project doesn't turn out amazing, you still have it, and then you can always get it photographed. The other thing I would say too is that like I mentioned this earlier on, the way a photographer might shoot a space can depend on what you're going to use the images for. If it's for your portfolio, it could be fewer images versus shooting for a magazine. So that's kind of, goes into discussing the cost of a photographer. Sorry, I don't have a more specific answer for you in terms of the rate. It's really hard to answer. I'm in the Bay Area, so my rates here probably don't apply necessarily to everywhere else. Okay, let's see. Next question. Hi, Karen. So one thing you can do is House actually has a photographer directory that for photographers that specifically shoot interiors. So that's one way you can find one. The other way I would suggest is actually Instagram. The reason I suggest Instagram is because you can get a good snapshot of what a photographer's work looks like directly from their Instagram and sort of kind of get a sense of their style and how they approach interiors. So there's also some other resources that are kind of more geared towards sort of like bigger name interior photographers. And if you're interested in that, definitely feel free to email me and I will send you a couple of resources for that. Hi, Maria. Do I suggest you buy lenses for the iPhone? You know, that's really hard for me to say. I don't know. I can't tell if you're a designer or not. So I'm going to answer it from both perspectives. If you're a designer and you feel like you're going to be shooting your spaces a lot with your iPhone, then I would say, yeah, sure, you can get a couple of like little attachable lenses for your iPhone to kind of give you some options in terms of the focal length that you're going to be using. Because sometimes, you know, I know they sell like ones where you can get super close. And then they also sell ones that are like fisheye, which I would avoid fisheyes, obviously, because you want it to feel natural. If you're curious, if you're listening to the webinar from the perspective of being a photographer, I would say I would rather invest the money on something like a solid regular camera versus spending the money on the iPhone lenses. And if you're curious about whether to buy a little point and shoot, and I think the great thing about iPhones or cell phones in general is that like the image is on your phone, it gets to be Instagrammed immediately. But I will say this, there are cameras out there that are little point and shoots that you can actually connect to via Wi-Fi and download the images directly from the camera to your phone and have them just as fast. It'll give you a little bit more latitude because some of those cameras have zoom functions and stuff like that that you can sort of use to zoom in and do different things with. Hopefully that helps. Do I recommend shooting interiors with lights off? I think the question is about, I think your question is asking me, is my preference whether interior should be shot with like the lights off in terms of like lighting fixtures. I don't think you're asking me if interior should be shot when the room is totally dark. I'll try and answer both. I personally, as my personal aesthetic, like lights off. I mean, like any pendant lights or sconces or anything like that, I don't like them on. And here's the reason why. My style of shooting tends to focus on natural light and like a room is being filled with sunlight. If a room is being filled with sunlight, it doesn't make sense to me about why the lights would be on. So that's just my personal take on that. Everybody's different. And then you can also have like a mixture of like, for example, if you have dimmers on some of the lights, like you can sort of dim them all the way down to where they're sort of on, but not at full blast. And then just in case this was your question about whether the light should be off, meaning like, should it be dark in the room? Like the sort of example shot I showed you, that shot is sort of kind of you definitely need to have a tripod in that situation because your exposure is going to be really long. So in that situation, you need to know how to work an SLR camera to shoot it with a really long shutter speed. Okay, hopefully I got that one answered. The question is about what apps I use to tweak the photo. So I basically use, like, if I'm shooting, when I'm shooting with my SLR camera, I use Lightroom and Photoshop just to adjust contrast and color and remove any color cast or anything like that. In terms of what I use on my phone, if I'm doing something, if I'm shooting something with my phone, I also use Lightroom mobile. And then that's kind of my go-to app just because it's pretty robust and it sort of mirrors the Lightroom that I have on my desktop. There's other ones that are out there called, like, there's one by Google called, let me check real quick. Snapseed, that I think is made by Google, is a pretty good one, and it's pretty robust and it's free. So that's one you can use. And then obviously I use the wonderful filters in Instagram from time to time. But having said that, when I do use the Instagram filters, I usually will click on a filter and then dial it way down because I want to maintain the image looking natural. Okay, yeah. I'm trying to think if there's any other ones. Oh, this one isn't, if you're interested more in apps to capture the image, you can look into apps that capture things in HDR format, and that will give you sort of, that will let you capture sort of areas that are really bright and really dark with a better exposure. Okay. Let's see, it says, how long would you tell a client to budget for shooting their home, say a 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 1,500 square feet? Okay, Lauren, that's a really good question. So I usually say there's 2 rooms in a house that can take a really long time. The living room is one of them, and then the kitchen could be the other one. Bedrooms tend to go very quickly because there's not a lot of variation in a bedroom. It's a bed, it's a dresser, you know, that sort of thing. And oftentimes they're a lot smaller, so you can kind of only shoot them from a couple of angles. So I would say, I usually tell clients that any project that involves shooting more than 2 big rooms should be considered a full day. And the reason I say that is because of this. When I shoot a space, I do it as such. I do a hero shot, which is sort of the establishing shot pulled back. And so I might shoot that from a couple of different angles. And then from there, I'll get in close and do vignettes. You know, so I'll do a couple of vignettes of the room and say it's a living room. In a living room, there could be multiple vignettes because you have, you know, you can have a sofa, you can have individual seating. So there's a lot of variation that can happen in there. And then after the vignette, we might go in there and get really close and get some detail shots. So you can see that goes quickly, like styling a living room or anything like that could easily take an hour. So I would say a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, I would say that's easily a day. Yeah, I would say that's, I personally it would personally take me a day to do that. Okay, hopefully that helps. Lauren, I think you're asking me if, the question is, do you always shoot a space with the client present? I think that you're asking me if the space gets shot when the homeowner's there? It's your client, the interior design client. In general, I've always shot spaces when the homeowner, your client, is not there. And the reason is this. Oftentimes, doing a photo shoot can be super intrusive. And I mean that from the perspective of like, you have to take down people's personal photos. You kind of have to take down their personal effects. And I find it sort of like, some people don't like that. And so I always like it when the homeowner's not there, because I feel a little bit more comfortable in terms of like moving furniture, moving their picture frames, like doing this and that. And like, it just feels like with them there, it's a little bit easier to get done what you need to get done. And then just in case your question was, do I ever shoot without the interior designer there? Yes, I've shot a couple of projects without the entire interior designer being there. But I've had another stylist there. So for example, like the interior designer has talked to like a colleague of theirs and been like, hey, can you help me shoot this space and help with the styling? Okay. Hi, Melissa. Okay, so if your question is about investing, if shooting your own interiors, is there a starter kit you would recommend must-haves? I would say must-have is definitely a camera that you can set to some sort of manual setting and you can choose the shutter speed or aperture on, because that gives you a little bit of latitude in terms of like getting the correct exposure. And like I was mentioning in another, for somebody else, they asked about lenses for the iPhone. I said, nowadays you can buy little point and shoots that actually have interchangeable lenses. So that's an option. So I would definitely, there is a starter kit, but if the investment in the starter kit is pretty expensive. So I would say, we're talking, there's something called a tilt shift lens, which like I mentioned in the webinar, lets you move the lens up and down without having to move the camera. But those lenses run in the $2,000 ballpark, and so if you combine that with getting like an SLR, a digital SLR, you're probably, even a basic digital SLR is probably about 500. So you're looking at 2,500 bucks just as a starter kit. So that's not very much a starter kit. So I would say for a designer, I don't know if you're a designer or not, so I'm going to assume that you are. For a designer, what I would say is do some research on a nice point and shoot that lets you interchange lenses and that has manual controls. And that would, you can get something like that for a few $100. Like I think Sony makes a couple of great ones that have the ability to interchange lenses. If you want more information, that's kind of a lengthy conversation. So definitely feel free to email me about that one. This question's about why HDR, what's happening that's different in HDR mode, and why did you suggest it? Kathleen, so HDR stands for high dynamic range. And the reason is because HDR apps, what they do is they take multiple exposures of the same scene and they combine it into one to give you a more balanced image. So for example, if you take a picture with your iPhone and there's a really bright area and a really shadowy area, how it's hard to reconcile those two and make the two look like they're properly exposed, like one's not super blown out and bright and the other one's not super dark. So what HDR does, it actually takes an exposure for the dark part and an exposure for the light part and combines them into one image to give you sort of a more even image. Having said that though, HDR does have a very specific look. It doesn't necessarily always turn out looking natural and bright and airy. So that's the drawback to HDR. Let's see. The question is, how do you choose which direction is the hero shot? I think you mean, how do I choose the composition of this hero shot? I don't know. That's a really hard one to answer. I sort of choose it intuitively, I suppose. There's just some images that like, there's just some images that, some angles that work better. Like they showcase different things. Like one might, you can see like a little peek of the window in one, whereas the other one just, you see like sort of a wall or a closed door. So it's like little things like that. It's not, I can't tell you, I can't give you like a list of checkpoints in order to choose a hero shot. But like I said, if you're sort of interested in talking more about it, definitely feel free to email me and I can sort of tell you why I chose framing for a certain image the way I did. Okay, this question is from Wynn. Let's see, it says, I'd love to ask about third-party use with sharing on Instagram and social media. The copyright 99% of the time remains with the photographer, but how can a designer make sure that there is no infringement when the work is shared so blindly between vendors and for-profit companies? That's a really, really good question. And it's actually a great question. So as a photographer, one of the things that I can only speak to personally, you sort of have to decide what battles are worth fighting. You know, like I've had my work show up on the West Elm blog and not been given credit for it. It's super cool. It's on the West Elm blog. And I know that they're not doing it maliciously. And a lot of times, all you have to do is send them like a direct message, be like, hey, I'm the photographer for this. Could you give me some photo credit? And then it's done. So I think if you as a designer are doing your best to make sure there's no infringement when like the work is being shared, you know, across social media, across different Instagram accounts, that's sort of all you can really do in this scenario. If, for example, my recommendation would be, I always love to hear from my designers, my clients, hey, West Elm, you know, Domino, whoever shared this project that we did, awesome, that's great. So I would say if you feel like it might be infringing, then I would reach out to the photographer and say, hey, just an FYI, such and such shared your photo. It's tough. It is it's a battle with photographers. I think as a designer, it's not necessarily your job, I don't think, to prevent infringement. I think infringement happens for the third party. They're the ones that should be not infringing. You've paid the photographer, you're using the images correctly, giving credit when you can, and if the other thing I would say about third party use is that if it's something for a vendor of yours, then definitely that's something that you should discuss with the photographer ahead of time. For example, let's say that you worked with a contractor or someone that's a cabinet maker. that possibly wants to use the images. Tell the photographer from the get-go that that's a possibility. And then potentially they can build that usage into the cost of the photo shoot, and you could possibly split the cost between you and the vendors. I can talk to you more about that if you want to email me. It's kind of it's a pretty lengthy discussion, but hopefully that helps. So this question is about detail shots. So detail shots are basically sort of up and close. Anything, like I sort of try and bring together like different and shoot them all in the same kind of shot. I'm trying to see if I can, let's see, let's see if I can't share the screen with you again. Yeah, basically detail shots is like, one of the shots that I showed you was like a detail shot from above of the couch and a little plant and a book. So you want to get close. But the thing is with the detail shots, even though you're getting close, you want to avoid distortion. So it should sort of have what we would call a natural, the human eye sees a certain, width, so to speak. So you want to kind of keep them in that, looking that way, not super, super close, like macro, like the kind of shots you see of bees and everything. But the point of I guess this might answer your question better. The point of a detail shot is to show off the choices that each designer makes. So for example, designers put a lot of thought into the fabrics that they use, the textures. So the point of a detail shot is to really get in there and show off how these things, the interplay between these things, which is not necessarily something that you can do with a pulled back shot like a vignette or a hero shot. Hopefully that helps. If you have more questions, definitely email me and I can we can look at some shots and discuss more in depth. The best way to prepare a client for a shoot, having them place their place. Yes, the best way to prepare a client for a photo shoot is to have them stow away all their sort of personal belongings. The thing I would say is have them stow away the personal belongings in a place that's out of the way and not in one of the rooms that you're going to be shooting. I've had that happen. And then we have to like move the stuff all around the house all day. So that's definitely have them clear out as much as possible. The other thing I would say is this is for the designer in terms of preparing the space for the photo shoot. Definitely get in there and style, but don't get crazy. Like don't, spend like 15 minutes like moving things an inch here and an inch there until your photographer gets there and you get the first shots. And the reason, like I said earlier in the webinar, is that flat space is very different than 3D space. So the way you're seeing it with your eyes is going to look different through the camera once everything's sort of compressed. So just put it in there loosely and like, oh, I think I want this here. And like, then once you start seeing the images come up, then you can go in there and really tweak it. The comment was from Kathleen saying, yes, definitely take a snapshot before removing a client's item so you can put them back. Unless of course the client's already like, move the stuff themselves. But yeah, definitely take a snapshot. And that way you can have that as a reference to where things go back. So it looks like that's it, folks. Wait, let's see. one more question from Kathleen. The question is, do you have a designer literally looking over your shoulder? How do your designers compensate their clients? First part of that question, do I literally have the designer looking over my shoulder? Yes. Not literally, but for example, the way I work is like I will go into the room and decide which angles I think work best. And then like I'll tweak the lighting and light it how I think it should be lit if that's necessary. And then I'll have the designer, I'll take the shots, get it all dialed in. Then I have the designer come over and say, hey, check it out. This is how I think it looks best. What do you think? Do you like this angle? And then if they're happy with the angle, then we go in there and really dial it in with the accessories. And the good thing about that is that there are no surprises at the end. When you get your images, you have already signed off on them. You know exactly what they're going to look like. And then in terms of how designers compensate their clients, I actually don't know the answer to that question, but I suspect it's that I think lots of clients are super excited to have their house photographed. It's like, it's super fun. And I think they usually get copies of the images to share, for personal use and stuff. But I don't know for sure. I think that's how most people do it. Yeah. Hey, Lauren, it looks like Ellie commented on my contact info. Definitely feel free to reach out if you have other questions. Okay, I think that's it for questions. Thanks everybody for joining, and definitely if I didn't answer one of your questions thoroughly enough, definitely feel free to email me and I will do my best to answer it more thoroughly. Or if you have other questions, definitely feel free to drop me a line.